Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another session of Tech School. Thanks, everybody, for joining us either on our Zoom call with our cohort or those who are joining via YouTube. We're going to have a great conversation about organizations today, and so we hope that it turns out to be something useful as you're getting started on launching your own business or growing it. So I'll let Stephen do introduction of our guest and remind you of a couple quick things before we get started.
Thanks, Sam. We got Jake on today. He works for Fractal. I will let him kind of give an introduction here in a minute, but before I do, just wanted to mention for those of you who are tuning in on YouTube, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Every sort of interaction that we get on videos like this helps push it out to more people, improves our reach. So that like or that comment, sharing your thoughts or giving us that thumbs up, that like might allow that video to reach an entrepreneur or startup that really needed to hear some things that Jake had to say today. So I just wanted to mention that, and I'll hand it over to Jake for an introduction and to get started.
Cool. Thank you, Stephen. As Stephen said, I'm part of a consulting company called Fractal. We help people build software products and also teams of human beings who can build software products while also treating each other kindly. And what Stephen and I are, a little bit of curling too, talking about today relates to something that we have seen as consultants throughout a number of our clients over a number of years. I mean, Fractal's just a year-old company, but most of us have been consultants for quite a long time. And that thing is just day-to-day, like focus and concentration issues, related in a big way to just the distractions of life right now. And one of the reasons, I'm here and started the conversation with Stephen and Curling is that we at Fractal right now are trying to get more intentional about our approach to working with our clients on focus and distraction. And we are housing this effort to sort of get intentional about that within a larger effort to sort of codify what is our sort of holistic approach to consulting and building software products in the form of a product that helps teams measure what's most important to them right now. So that's kind of a little bit of background, like kind of why I'm in the headspace of focus, concentration, distraction, deep work, deliberate practice. And I guess we also put in the title Death by Slack, referencing that interruption problem. Does that get you what you need? Any questions before Stephen hits the questions he's ready to hit me with?
I think that's good, Jake. And I love the Death by Slack because even our cohort is using Slack. So that's good.
Yeah, it's a dangerous thing, right? Double-edged sword.
So we can get into it. We have a few questions, like you mentioned, we can pose to you, and then if anyone else has questions, they can chime in, let us know in the chat, or if you're watching on YouTube, and we can ask them live while you're on. So the first one that Curling and I had for you was, so you talked about deep work, dealing with the topic of distraction, right? So as a solopreneur, now we have a lot of entrepreneurs that we deal with that are solopreneurs, right? What's a good way for them to increase their productivity, or how do they deal with that?
I think one of the first things to think about is just sort of what is it, if you're thinking about activity, what is it production, and what are the other things that you do that you just kind of maybe have to do that maybe you don't want to define as that at that particular level. So I think like one way of approaching that is to think about the work that you have to do and all of the bits of work that you have to do as part of the entrepreneurship effort that you're involved with, and categorize them. So, I mean, a lot of what I've been thinking about sort of began with reading a book called Deep Work by Cal Newport, which is this is a professor at Georgetown, I think, and he, has this really radical approach to how he organizes himself and does his work that's been really successful for him. And he's, done some research on, other folks historically who have worked in sort of radical ways, and has come to the conclusion that, you want to be thinking about the world in terms of deep and shallow work. And, the deep work being the things that you are very sort of cognitively demanding, are things that are sort of wildly important to whatever the goals are that you're pursuing at the moment. So within that sort of solopreneurship frame, these are going to be the very highest priorities for the young company. And then the shallow stuff is, often this is going to be things like writing emails, having short conversations with people, or meetings that are not like really intensely focused on making decisions. And then kind of everything else of just like maintaining, putting a bunch of screenshots in the trash that are on your desktop of your computer, right? Like these kinds of things that can fall into the sort of shallow category, but more important stuff as well. But anyway, so one thought about sort of being productive as an individual and not sort of as part of a team, categorize your work, right? Deep and shallow, or even maybe just sort of big and small, right? And think about which are the things that you need a lot of need time and concentration to really deliver on. And then schedule every minute of your day. This is, again, like something that sort of has come out of not only reading Cal Newport stuff, but other reading that I've done related to this, is that being really intentional about your time it's difficult, and it is the kind of thing that I think a lot of people can struggle with and feel like it is, an infringement on your freedom. But if you have like a fully blocked out calendar, not of meetings, but of like what you intend to do during different blocks of time, and you recognize which of those blocks of time are blocks in which you need to be focused on this one thing that is wildly important right now, that will get you to do that. And then for little stuff, batch it up. Think about it in terms of what are some things that kind of go together that you can maybe get done in a 30 or 60 minute block together. Put that on the calendar too. And then I guess sort of maybe this shouldn't go without, this goes without saying maybe, or maybe I should be saying this, is that in your planning process, really do question your priorities again and again and again, right? And make sure that you feel very confident in what it is that you should be doing today versus what you should be doing tomorrow. I think that in thinking about like what is production, what is productivity, the things that connect you to those really, really huge goals that your enterprise or effort has right now, ought to count for more, in the way you think about your productivity.
Thanks, Jake. There's a lot of good stuff there. So transitioning from that question, kind of the next one we had on the list was, so how do you pick a co-founder? What's a good approach for picking a co-founder to help you be more productive?
So a couple of things. I've been thinking about this as we sort of touched on this previously, Stephen. So one of the things that I'm doing with the folks that I'm collaborating most closely with right now within Fractal, is we're writing up working agreements, which is basically lists of 4 or 5 things that we agree to as a small team that are going to be sort of, it can be sort of as deep as a principle by which you work, or as as kind of small as, hey, our work days are going to start overlapping at 10 a.m. So therefore, if we're going to schedule meetings, it's going to be at 10 a.m. ideally, right? Things that we agree are important about making our collaboration work well. So I say this in the context of choosing the co-founder as just like, I would test someone's openness to agreeing to the ways of working that you believe are ways of working that are going to work for you. So yeah, I mean, think about that for yourself on any given team. Like what are the working agreements that you would propose to your team, right? These could have something to do with time. They could have something to do with concentration and distraction, right? It could be something like, we're not going to have we'll have a communication rule that is basically the only kind of communication for which we're going to expect a very, very prompt response is going to be a phone call. And we're only going to use phone calls either scheduled or in case of emergency. Right? Like that would be an example of sort of like a communication related working agreement. And so I would say in terms of choosing a co-founder, you want to make sure you have somebody who's going to be on the same page with you about what you ought to be agreeing to, what your sort of standard of performance ought to be as a team. To sort of like, that would help you sort of keep the trust in that. And then another thing about choosing someone to work super closely with that I would recommend is to check in with that person about how they learn. I often say, like in the world, when working with startups, or kind of keep in mind when working with startups is, learning is the coin of the realm. Like you're likely not going to be making any money right away. And so measuring by that in terms of success doesn't make a ton of sense. But if you can devise a way that you're measuring by what you're learning and how effectively that you're learning, whether that's about your customers or about, what it's going to take to get you where you need to go. So I would, I would suggest an emphasis on learning, and I would suggest you want to find a co-founder who, when you hear them describe how it is that they learn well, what they do to learn, that tracks with you, and that feels right to you. I recently read a book called Peak by Anders Ericsson. It's about, maximizing performance and sort of like expert performers often in music and chess and sports like tennis and golf, and I guess all sports also, but the ways sort of like expert performers practice, there's real common threads there, and that evaluating sort of how one practices, or what are the ways in which one practices, is a way of thinking about learning. How do you get better at what you do through the practice of what you do? How do you give yourself feedback on what you're doing? And then in the context of a collaboration, how do you feel about giving one another feedback? So I don't know, if you find somebody that you're interested in, I would ask about learning and feedback loops and how you're going to continuously improve at what you do.
Awesome. That's great. So we did get a question from Vivian during that last question. Vivian, I know you're on the call here. Do you want to just ask it in person?
Maybe not.
I guess not. We can ask it. So she said, do you couch everything as milestones and then prioritize them by tasks, or what is your approach there?
Well, in software product development, we like to think in releases. We like to think about whatever the product is that we're working on. You want to have it in a releasable state, right? And that releasable state doesn't have to be releasable to the whole world. It has to be just releasable to whoever it is that you're releasing to, right? It could be to your one colleague, right? It could be to, any sort of small group. But so we think about things in terms of releases, and we think about how do we narrow the scope of every release into only what is necessary to sort of introduce some, unit of business value or small number of units of business value that are sort of part of that product. And then sort of, prioritize. Well, I guess we're asking about this in the context of prioritization. So, in terms of what the next release should be, I think prioritize based on what information you have about your users and what they want the most, or what you need to deliver to them most, or what problem you need to solve for them most, and then again make that release small, and hopefully break it into sort of like small and fairly bite-sized engineering tasks. So anyway, I say all this about like building a software product in part because like that's where I live in work. But I think you can think about that. You can think about releases with anything, right? Well, you can think about with a piece of writing, for example, that you have a first draft of something that you put together, and maybe that release is only to one person, like the one person who's going to be helping you most in sort of turning this into a workable piece of writing that can go out further. And then think about it as what's the next thing, how do you get to the next level and sort of release to the next set of people. I don't know, Vivian, does that help at all? Like thinking about, does that sort of somewhat answer your question? I don't know, think about the audience, think about the customers.
Yeah, I was asking about your kind of leadership philosophy when you were saying, what do I need to be doing today? What do I need to be focused on, and prioritizing that? So I like the way you tied it to the, business value of everything, and that the release may just be to your colleague, it may just be to your board, it may just be to your co-founder if you're formulating in an ideation phase. So that was really helpful.
Cool. Great.
So Jake, kind of branching off that last question and maybe some of the things you touched on in some of your previous answers, what are some of the best ways to track productivity? Are there any tools that you've seen work very well that you'd kind of recommend for entrepreneurs or startups out there?
I would say start small, start super simple, and I would if you especially if you're sort of doing this on just a very small scale, think about it in terms of time, and think about what is your top priority goal or problem you're trying to solve, and maybe you just track time that's like totally focused on delivering on that if you have some way of doing that. Again, like I would say start super analog, super simple. Hang on, we're getting to the point where maybe I have a little slide to show you. Let me just see if I can find this thing. And in Deep Work, in the book Deep Work by Cal Newport, he talks about the way that he tracks the deep work that he does, and his perspective on it is like hours doing deep work is a great sort of lead measure or leading indicator of your progress on the most important stuff that you're working on, or maybe the most important thing that you're working on. And the way he tracks it, which I'm looking for now, and I'll share my screen when I find it, is kind of great, in my opinion. Let's see, there we go. All right, I'm going to share my screen for a sec. So this is Cal Newport's really impressive way of tracking. This is what he measures. Whoops. It's just hours of deep work on a piece of paper taped to his wall. Right? Like this is, and he thinks that this is a great way to do it. And in writing about this, he references Jerry Seinfeld, the comedian. And I don't know if anybody's heard the story of Jerry Seinfeld, like his advice to, one of his pieces of advice he gives to young comedians is to track the days that they write a new joke. If you write any new material on any day, like you put a red X on your calendar, and you try to make a chain of red X's as long as you possibly can. And that's sort of, one way of thinking about tracking productivity, right? What is the thing that you got to do every day, and did you do it? Again, maybe that's reductive, but I think it's pretty useful. But and I think something like that, and something like deep work hours, is something that can also be think about it from the perspective of what the audience is for this, right? Like you can track on yourself, and that's totally fine. But maybe you want to spread this to your co-founder, or to your team, or to your investors, or whatever. We have a pretty at Fractal, on each of our engagements, we client permitting, of course, or situation permitting, we do a like a daily update that we write. And this is sort of one of the, when I'm working on a client engagement, it's sort of one of my jobs is to write the daily update. And within the daily update, we will report on any sort of day-to-day measurements. So for right now, Farshad, the engineer that I'm working with, one of the things that we've agreed to measure are uninterrupted afternoons for Farshad. And so every day in my daily update email to our little stakeholder group, I'm going to say whether or not Farshad had an uninterrupted afternoon the day before. We also track sort of meetings over 30 minutes. Another little thing that we want to make sure that we're keeping under control. And yeah, it's just sort of a way of holding yourselves accountable with a hopefully slightly larger group than just yourself. Yeah, I think that's something to start with in terms of measuring.
Awesome. I know Curling and I, especially with the startups and Joanna, the startups that we deal with on a daily basis, especially our cohort, we love to give them actionable steps, right? So for you to, talk about the red X's and the things that are very concrete, somebody can grab onto and maybe implement tomorrow, right, are very awesome. So thank you for giving us some tips there.
Yeah, no problem.
So I think we have some questions from Joanna. Joanna, do you want to just ask them?
Hello. You're muted. You're still muted.
Now am I muted?
There you go.
Better. All right. I was curious, since you're part of a startup too, what kind of metrics you're tracking? Would you be willing to share what your sort of key performance indicators are?
Well,
specifically related to productivity, I assume that those things are tied together.
Yeah, this is specific. This is what we're working on now, is trying to be better about this. As I said, right, uninterrupted afternoons for Farshad. Right now, we're trying to do it team by team, right? We at this point we're not feeling confident enough, or we want to be careful with this, right? We don't want to push measurement on everybody when it's going to be something that's not necessarily going to be sort of really important to that particular team.
Yeah.
So we're working team by team to define this. And so
that's good.
On the team now, right, it's uninterrupted afternoons for Farshad the engineer, and for any engineer that joins the project, and also for designers as well, right? Whatever measure that individual person wants to track about their really ability to sort of get totally concentrated in the work and be non-distracted. So that's something that we want to be tracking everywhere. There's a little app that we've started building as sort of for an experimentation tool, or the beginnings of this platform that we want to be building, that is tracking 90+ minute uninterrupted blocks of time on your calendar. So if you're imagining a calendar in which, if you have the discipline in your calendar to have, or you have the practice in your calendar to have meetings and like lunchtime on your calendar. The idea is that, our little app right now will look at that and say, how many 90+ minute blocks can I fit in here that can be like serious work time? So that's a thing. Hours in meetings is something that we think is important to track. Part of this is due to the user research we've done about like what people are worried about in terms of distraction. Is that, you have some cultures that will not be intentional about when they schedule meetings and for how long. And so therefore we want to start tracking that in some way. So again, in working with Farshad right now, he thinks it's really important to have a delineation between a meeting that's less than 30 minutes long and a meeting that's longer than 30 minutes. So we have this 30-minute meeting, 30+ minute meeting tracking thing that we're using to kind of hold ourselves accountable for basically our ability to prepare for a conversation and be ready to have the most important parts of that conversation and then get back to the work. We also have on the calendar like 2-hour-long planning sessions that we are totally fine with having them be an hour long. You know, I mean, we don't want to take away from planning. And so we want to think about what you're tracking in terms of like, you know, how many of this thing that you're tracking, what's your target, right? Even if it's something that might be considered to be negative in some light. So those are the big ones right now. Meetings and then lack of interruption. We really want to get into tracking related to this lack of interruption thing. We want to start tracking our behavior on whatever chat apps we're using, because we believe that is a dangerous thing. Not that you shouldn't be using the chat apps at all, but that you need discipline in using the chat apps, and you need to be careful not to get sucked into using the chat apps in a way that just pulls you out and doesn't let you be your best self in your work.
So just on the heels of that, I'm hearing you say like you have a couple of different kinds of meetings where you have like shorter meetings that are focused on maybe like decision making or like a goal, and you have these longer meetings that are like where like if you were all in the same space, you might hang out together and do some planning and brainstorming, and those are longer time periods, and that is still time well spent, and you don't sort of think about that as like not productive time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think planning time, like planning together, one of the things that we sort of identify as an anti-pattern at some of the clients that we work with is when the planning work becomes detached from the engineers who actually do the work, right? When you have your product people like doing all this pre-planning work and then sort of like showing up at an iteration planning meeting or sprint planning or whatever you call it, and like saying, okay, here we are. How's this look? Here are the acceptance criteria. Is everything good? We really believe it's important to have the engineers deeply involved in that process. You know, engineers should own those stories just as much as product people should own those stories. And so we want there to be planning time. We want there to be regular planning time, but we want it to happen at a regular weekly cadence that we can get in the habit of doing.
Yeah.
This, you know, maybe this is kind of neither here nor there, but I at least, or many of us believe very much in a 1-week cadence over a 2-week cadence, because human beings can think in days and we can think in weeks. 2 weeks, not a cycle that works. It's just not. It doesn't work right. And so you get into the situation when you have a 2-week iteration cycle, where there's like, am I in week A or am I in week B? Like, what's happening right now? And it's extra cognitive strain that we think is kind of stupid to have.
Love it. I think that's been a struggle that I've seen is the planning time versus like the building. Like you're in a sprint, you're running it, but you're also trying to figure out like what are we going to do in the next in the next iteration, the next release, the next, you know, however you want to name that chunk of time. I think that I've seen teams like they work on their list and then they exhaust their list and they're like, okay, now I have to plan some more stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's fine. Again, especially if, like, again, with working with Farshad right now, like we have the time 10 to 10:30 every day on our calendars where it's like we together have that time. We don't schedule anything over that time, and that is our kind of like signal. We don't use it every day, but it's like we have it there. If we need to do that, the time to do it is at 10.
Yeah.
You know, and make it a habit. You know, and again, if it's just maybe we have one little conversation to have at 10 and we're done in 7 minutes. Great. That's perfectly fine.
Those are the best. Those make everybody happy.
Yeah. But yeah, I think again, it all just ties back to this idea that I think that it's really important to pay attention to time and scheduling, and it's like this mundane thing. But I think that there's a lot of power in it. And you do have to kind of surrender to it. You have to be, you have to take the plunge into saying, like, I'm going to be kind of a radical about this.
Yeah.
And yet I do strongly believe that there's freedom in framing yourself time wise, and especially in these times, right? I mean, I know you guys have kids. You know, I have 2 sons. I've got first grade on Zoom in the house, right? I am relegated to the porch. You know, there's more important stuff going on inside, and so we also have a 2.5-year-old, and so my wife and I, and she works as well. We have an incredibly tightly scheduled life right now that is part of just COVID reality.
Yeah.
And so to not be intensely scheduled would be, like, you know, dangerous in terms of like the family situation.
That's a good point. I personally like the intensely scheduling works, like, it really resonates for me, but I'm a schedule person. But I always block, like, this time is for prep for this other meeting that I'm having. Like, and this time is for me to do my email cleanup, and this time is for me, like, I block, like, if it's important enough to me that I really actually want to accomplish it, I put it on my calendar, and that way nothing gets scheduled over top of it. I know I'm going to have enough time. I know I'm not going to forget. Because I'm going to get little reminders going to pop up and tell me, now it's time for you to finish that thing that you didn't finish.
Yeah, no, I'm fully in support of that practice. I think it's a really smart practice.
Yeah. All right. I see there's another question from Vivian and one from Brianna as well. So I'm going to cede the floor.
What does the pitch deck look like now versus when we started, Vivian? That's a good question. So this is a sort of entrepreneurial project. So I will say that, like, the pitch deck, I don't know, you saw like a tiny little piece of it. It's not your traditional pitch deck. But one thing we've realized about our pitch, right? So what we're asking for in building what we're building, right? Which is ultimately a measurement tool that codifies the different ways in which we believe teams should consider measuring themselves, and then makes it possible for teams to sort of make decisions about what it is that they want to measure. There is this element of surrender to it, this element of saying, okay, I'm going to work in public. I'm going to say it's okay to, I'm going to track my time. I'm going to put the little bit of time in that I need to do to sort of keep a good calendar, or at least make sure that I put lunch on the calendar so that the system can track how many of these, you know, how much uninterrupted time I have. I think we've evolved from focusing the pitch on the manager, right? The person who wants the morning newspaper view of a handful of teams and wants to know, are there any red flags? Are there any reasons that I ought to get involved? You know, the pitch sort of began there because that's who the customer is, right? Like, our sort of go-to-market strategy with what we're doing is to go to our clients, our former, current, future clients, and get them to try the product. So we're focused on that argument, right? What's the value prop to that group of people? We've evolved to have more emphasis on the value prop for the end user. I'm not totally sure this is a good or a bad thing, but it's the way it's going. And I think that we just believe that it's really important, if we're going to have if a tool like this is going to be sort of like successful over time, it's going to really need buy-in from people at the end user level, because it's difficult to some extent to sort of submit to it. And so we want to make sure that it's clear to that group what is the benefit that they get right? Emphasizing how this does is as like a tool for managing the managers, right? We want those managers to know that there's like no time to work right now because you managers are calling all these meetings, right? We want to emphasize stuff like that, so that the engineers, designers, or anyone who would be joining the system will feel like they are not just being surveilled, but that they are getting something valuable out of this that will ultimately just lead them to be happier in their work, and feel like they have the ability to level up in ways that they want to, or like really gain sort of super valuable experience in doing this and feel ownership over what's happening and feel the, feel the progress. Are you good with that, Vivian, for now? Anything more to talk about on that?
I like that response though, Jake. That was good.
Sorry. Thanks, Jake.
Cool. To Brianna, the question I see in the chat is, does overplanning ever interfere with problems that may occur? It can, if you're not humble about your planning. I think that plan's a plan, I mean, it's not the actual thing, and it's not always going to be the actual thing. And when, and maybe I'm a little clarification here. So by problems that may occur, do you mean just like sort of like some issue that emerges that's like, oh, we really got to deal with this right now?
Yeah, exactly. Like, just if anything were to happen, some type of, enormous hiccup or a small one, like I just want to know, like, does overplanning, like, does that hiccup set you off track if you were to overplan, or do you plan for something to happen, like anticipating that to happen?
Well, so a couple ways to answer that. So one is that in planning, so to think about, so you're scheduling every minute of your day and you're sort of really intense about the planning effort that you're doing at like a personal level. You've got to be ready that if something goes wrong, or you've got to be ready that if something seems to be more important than you thought it would, becomes more important than you thought it would be, or really just it needs to get done and it's going to take more time, you got to be okay about moving those calendar blocks along, right? You've got to be okay about the thing that's going to drop out of the end of the day. And yeah, maybe you can kind of handle that after the kids are asleep, in my case. And I will tend to do that. And that is something that I'm working on, to like try to be more disciplined about not doing that and going to bed earlier. But be ready to move things into the next day. Be ready to sort of change that schedule. Like adopting like a radical scheduling thing means you got to put in a little extra time on the calendar. But be humble about it, right? Like don't get crazy about making sure that everything lines up exactly in the day. Like you got to move it if you need it. And then, at a larger level, in terms of planning like an iteration of work for a team of software engineers or any team that you're planning work for, something that some of my colleagues feel really strongly about, some of my engineer colleagues feel really strongly about, is trying to plan enough work to take up 80% of the week or of the iteration, however long it is, and try to leave 20% of the time, or like, work sessions, or however you're organizing your thinking around estimations. Leave it for sort of what one of my colleagues calls quality of life improvements. And so these quality of life improvements, might be like refactoring some little element of the code that has been bugging people. It might be to, I don't know, add some kind of feature to your system that is not so much, not user facing, but is actually sort of for the engineers. You get some of that stuff done. You fit a little bit of that stuff in. You don't plan it, but you have it there, like in your backlog, in your icebox, as something that you might pull in during that sort of 20% of the iteration. But then, of course, that's also just sort of slack time in case something balloons and you need to give it a bunch more time. So just one way of thinking about planning such that you want to have a little, don't plan it like right up to that edge, because first of all, you don't want to be demoralized when you miss the target every single time. And then second of all, you want to get to these quality of life things. And finally, you want to be ready for the issue that you didn't see coming.
And that's awesome. I really like that. The 80-20 rule. I just got a team from USC, and I'm like trying to, figure out my planning strategy and everything. So I'm going to take that into account.
Yeah, think about that.
It'd be very helpful.
Yeah, it's definitely something that should make your engineers happy, right? Because it gives them that little extra bit of freedom and ability to sort of focus on themselves and their, the plight of being a software engineer. Curling those well.
Yes. Good answer. I have, I know, Stephen, I know you have your one answer offhand, one question that we always give everyone, but I had this one question for Jake. Jake, this is just some sort of maybe validation or something of that nature, but I've always organized my days in a way where it's like Monday is planning day, right? Tuesday is people day, because I'm an introvert. I got can't get that night's sleep in for Tuesday. Wednesday is actually really these project days. We have a lot of project meetings on Wednesday, and Thursday I'm producing something, right? Either it's gonna be a document or a release or something like that. And Friday I have this thing is pretty much just called like I just review what has happened on Friday. I used to not have my phone on Friday. So I'm like, what do you think about that? That's totally my methodology, right? I didn't write a book on it, but that's just what I've done, Jake. And I understand what you're saying, but what do you think about that in general? And I don't say I do that every week, but that's just how I kind of schedule my blocks in that way.
My first reaction is that I love that it's intentional, right? I think that having like a lot of intention to it makes it just an awesome starting point. I think, planning on Mondays and is, you got to do it. If you're thinking about things, if you think about weeks, that's a way that you organize yourself and a way that you evaluate yourself. Like, plan on Mondays for sure. And then reviewing on Fridays too. I think I like, I try to schedule retros with the teams, whatever team I'm working on Fridays. I think it sets you up nicely for planning on Monday. So I think that's a great sort of pattern to focus on. I think I love just giving a lot of time to reviewing your notes, or review. I think this is something that I have been trying to do more of in my planning efforts. Given that I operate on this daily cadence of updating a group of stakeholders. Like, I have a block of time every day where I have on my calendar that, like, this is going to be, I'm looking back at my notes. I'm putting a draft of this update together, right? Like, this is good. I'm trying to get in that habit, or I'm in that habit. I'm trying to improve that habit. So,
Sure.
I sort of do something similar just on a day-to-day level. But yeah, I think fundamentally, if you might have to diverge from it, right? You can't always keep it, but as a default, something to default to, it's fantastic. I mean, have that thing you want to default to, and then let it mutate when it needs to mutate.
Great. Yeah, I like how you say being intentional. That's helped me out a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. One other note, though, Jill, who's kind of head of the Innovation Hub, she had to leave a little bit early. She said sorry, but she said she immediately went out to go buy the deep work book. So she said, "Thank you, Jake."
Yeah. A warning again to anybody reading the deep work book, right? Like this, he's total weirdo. But I think that makes it an interesting book, right? This guy is a total radical about what he does, and that makes it like literarily interesting, I think. You know, almost all of his references are to sort of old white men, which is like a little stale and ridiculous, but you know, bear with him. You know, he is who he is. He's this total radical, like he's totally in his work all the time. And yeah, I think it's definitely a worthwhile read.
That's great. That's great. Stephen, you want to have any like final thoughts? And I know you had your question too.
Yeah. There was a question that, Curly and I kind of wanted to bookend this talk with, something that we've asked a few of our other speakers, similar question before, but it goes like, so imagine you had a chance to talk to your younger self before, kind of at the early stages of your journey with all this research you're doing on productivity, deep work, deliberate practice, death by Slack, right? What are one or two tips that you would kind of give your past self, given what you know now and everything you've been through?
So I think be very careful with the network tools, the communication media that you use, and try to wall it off. And I think this ties into what we talked about with working agreements, right? And the teams you're working with, make sure everybody understands what the meaning of different forms of communication are, what the expectations are around different forms of communication. And based on what those expectations are, try to plan and be intentional about when it is that you are dealing with correspondence of one kind or another. Because I think there's a trap that is, you got emails pouring in, you got chats pouring in, and you work on that, right? It's coming in, you want to help people, you want to unblock someone who might be blocked by something that they need from you. And that's a great intention. But if you get caught in feeling productive only by communicating, that can get dangerous, because I'm pretty sure it's very rare that the case is that if you break it all down to like one or two or three like wildly important things you're doing right now, probably communicating over email and like whatever you can accomplish with that doesn't often tie in that well with one of those things, right? I mean, it can sometimes, but like, I don't know, be careful spending a lot of time there. That's one thing. And then, another thing, it's more than just telling my younger self, right? This is also just like telling myself now too, is as exciting as it may be and as into it as you may be, recognize the importance of like getting it out of your mind for part of the day. Having kids is a really good way to do this, because you don't have really a choice. I guess maybe you may have a choice, but if you have kids and come to the realization, as I have, that if you really wanted to be measuring the value of your time against value spending your time in one way versus value spending your time in another way, probably the most objectively valuable way you can spend any minute of any time is like totally engrossed in being with one or more of your children. The long-term value of that moment or hour or whatever it is massive. And so therefore, having kids is a good way of forcing yourself out of the mind space of thinking about the stuff you're thinking about for the work that you're doing. So again, being intentional about that, about putting the work down and letting yourself recharge mysteriously, whatever happens in our brains when we stop thinking about something.
Those are great tips. Curling, do you have anything to echo on the children comment?
Oh yeah, no, I think that's incredible. I do know if you do have children, there's a level of focus you have to have when you're not with them, right? You're saying like, I have this window, and you're intentional with that window, and then when that window's gone, then you're enjoying, Peppa Pig and everybody, right? So I think I think that's a key one. But I just want to just thank you, Jake. You've always been very conscientious to all of our startups, and I always enjoy just the way that you actually, in some ways, you just really, you really have this empathy for them, right? And I know you being a founder too. I one last or I don't think it would be a question. I just want to just putting on just an observation of you is that you're really great at looking at these very complex things and making them simple. So I really like your Seinfeld story, how you brought that up, and that I think that's really great. Is there any other story of that nature or example of that nature that you have that's like one? And I like that story, but is there any other story you have, something where someone's tracking that progress or tracking it in that way? That's
Good question. Nothing is jumping to my mind.
Sure.
I'm sure we could find stuff like this in the world of professional athletes.
Yeah. Good. Good.
I got one little story that relates to. So first of all, someone to study when it comes to like focus and concentration and sort of like intention in practice is Kobe Bryant.
Okay.
Right? Like this guy, I don't know, famous for being like really focused. And so, I don't know, look up Kobe Bryant and focus. And there's interviews with him and stuff like that, which will give you some interesting stuff about Kobe in particular. Another thing about practice is Michael Phelps. So Michael Phelps's coach was really into this notion, and Kobe does this too, this notion of mental reps of different scenarios that you might encounter, right? And in business speak, you might call this like planning for a rainy day or something like that, right? And this is the idea that think about what are some things that might like break you from your routine or make something go not quite the way that you expect it to go. So in the case of Michael Phelps, it's like a race. What are some things that could happen in a race that are not what Michael Phelps and his coach think are going to happen? One of the races that one of his like major finals in the Beijing Olympics in 2008, I can't remember what stroke it was or whatever. I'm not really big Olympics guy, but I heard this story. I think it's cool. Anyway, he immediately upon just like diving into the water, his goggles filled up with water and he could not see. But he and his coach had planned like, okay, your goggles could fill up with water. Probably not going to happen, but have a bit of a plan for that. So Michael Phelps had a plan for that. He had the numbers in his mind of how many strokes of butterfly or whatever he was doing, got him to the other side, and he does his flip turn, and then how many strokes it takes to get back and finish the race. And he set a world record when that happened in Beijing, blind. And it was just simply a matter of practicing in a certain way, like mental reps practice in a certain way. Like it's not like he was in the pool swimming with his eyes closed. It was that he and the coach thought about it and like thought about what they might do, sort of game planned for it. You got to, again, game planning, another thing related to this, like think about like in NFL, right? I mean, NFL football or college football, right? Game planning, I think, is a really interesting metaphor for work and game scripting and thinking about what plays you're going to call in different situations early on in the game. If you want to get into football as a metaphor for working on these projects, Bill Walsh, the sort of legendary coach of the 49ers dynasty in the 80s and early 90s, wrote a book called The Score Takes Care of Itself, which is pretty cool book about this kind of thing. I don't know.
That was great. That was great. Yeah, stories we've been finding out more and more, Jake, really resonate with people, right? So your stories are always good. So I was just trying to pull out some of those stories. That was great about Kobe. Definitely about the Michael Phelps. Never heard of Michael Phelps' story, so that was great. That anything doing Olympics is always good, and that's a good segue to give it back to Stephen. Stephen's trying out for Olympic trials and everything. Right? We'll let Stephen close everything up.
Awesome. Thanks, Curling. Just to kind of echo Curling here. Thank you, Jake, for coming on and speaking today. I have a lot of great stuff you touched on. A lot of good stories, a lot of good topics, some great answers to some questions from the audience. So thank you. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to jump on with us. Yeah,
you're welcome.
So for those of you who are tuning in, thanks for tuning in. For those of you watching on YouTube, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. Every like, every comment that we get on videos like this helps push it out to more people, improves our reach. So that like or that comment that you leave might allow this video to reach somebody who really needed to hear some things on productivity and some of the stories that Jake shared today. So it's an easy way for those of you listening, those of you watching, to kind of give back to the entrepreneurial community by just helping this info reach more people. So thank you. But as always, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you on another episode of Tech School.
All right. Thanks, Jake.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Right.
Talk to you later.
Hey everyone, Steven here with Fokcus. Thanks for tuning in today. If you liked the video today, be sure to hit that like button and give us a thumbs up. We really appreciate it. If you have thoughts and you'd love to share them, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. We love to hear from you guys. We're always looking for feedback on how we can improve and make our videos better, so feel free to leave a comment if you can. And if you'd like to be notified on future videos and future episodes of Tech School, feel free to hit the subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and you'll be notified anytime we post a new video. But as always, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next video.